In his book, Jesus and Nonviolence, theologian and activist Walter Wink tells this story about how one evening this large crowd of activists were outside Ebenezer Baptist Church, and a funeral home operator from Montgomery pulled up. A group of black students were demonstrating near the Capitol, he told them. Police surrounded them on horseback. And then when they blocked their way out, they told the demonstrators to disperse or face the consequences. They couldn't disperse, of course, not with the horses there, so the police started beating them at will. And then they blocked the ambulances so they couldn't get to the students for 2 hours. And as he told this story, predictably, the crowd outside of the church started to seethe. They'd been preparing to march, but now the crowd crackled with this new, furious energy. "Let's march," someone called. And then they saw that behind them, just a short distance away, the Alabama state troopers had lined up rank by rank, joined by the infamous Sheriff Jim Clark, just waiting. And just as things appeared that they would explode, a young black minister stepped to the mic. "I think it's time we sang a song," he said, and started a tune many of them were familiar with. "Do you love Martin King?" he sang, and the crowd sang back, "Certainly, Lord." And as he got into it, he went through the whole Southern Christian Leadership Conference. "Do you love this person? Do you love that person?" And every time they'd answer fervently, "Certainly, Lord." And then without warning, he sang, "Do you love Jim Clark?" And the crowd stumbled a little bit. "Certainly, Lord?" It's more of a question than an answer. "Do you love Jim Clark?" the minister repeated, knowing that they had to get this, or the night could well end in a massacre. "Certainly, Lord," the crowd answered, starting to understand. And again they did this until the "Certainly, Lord" grew more confident, and Reverend James Bevel took the mic. "We are not just fighting for our rights," he said. "We are fighting for the good of all society. It is not enough to defeat Jim Clark." Then he turned and addressed the state troopers directly. "Do you hear me, Jim? We want you converted. We cannot win by hating our oppressors. We have to love them into changing." And can you imagine being in that crowd in that moment? To have received that news about what just happened in Montgomery, and then to hear, "Do you love Jim Clark?" So many of us have gotten used to this teaching, to love your enemies. And we're so kind of automatically, passively on board that we can forget just how offensive it can sound. I imagine it was similar to those who heard Jesus teach, those surrounded by Romans that had beaten or crucified their friends and family. I imagine it sounded out of touch or idealistic. Martin Luther King, in a 1957 sermon on the same text, preached, "Many would go so far as to say Jesus was an impractical idealist who never quite came down to earth." So the arguments abound. But far from being an impractical idealist, Jesus has become a practical realist. The words of this text glitter in our eyes with a new urgency, he preached. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, this command is absolutely necessary for the survival of our civilization. It is love that will save our world and our civilization, even love for our enemies. So this morning, that's what we want to explore. This call to love our enemies, far from being a sentimental call to politeness or an out-of-touch call of an idealist, is actually a practical and powerful tool that can transform our minds and our world. So let's get started. First, loving our enemies can be a powerful tool for transformation on a personal level. Some of you may know the story of Megan Phelps Roper. Phelps as in the granddaughter of the infamous Fred Phelps, founder of Westboro Baptist Church. And I know Westboro has kind of fallen out of the spotlight in recent years, thank God, but you're probably familiar with their work protesting funerals and their explicit homophobic signs. So Megan Phelps Roper grew up in that world. And as she did, they put her in charge of the church's social media, spreading the same caustic message online that they did in person. And she was good at her job. Dutifully, she would post some pretty horrific things and stir up some crowds, but as she did, something unexpected happened. Through the outrage-fueled echo chamber that is the internet, Phelps Roper found that people would talk back to her. And I don't just mean the reactionary, judging people telling her that she was an awful person, although there were plenty of those. I mean kind and curious voices, voices she wasn't used to hearing. "Everyone must tell you they hate you all the time," someone once said. "That's got to be hard. How are you?" And although her skin was thick at first, it turned out those messages started to wear her down. They spoke to a part of her that was deeply hungry for compassion and connection. And after years of this, Megan Phelps Roper found the space to experiment with this question: is this really who I want to be? And in 2012, at great personal cost, she left Westboro and started working toward reconciliation. Stories like this abound. And I don't know about you, but I have a hard time thinking of stories where healthy transformation occurred because enough people yelled and shamed their enemy. It's a trick that Jesus used often, I think, offering belonging and compassion before ever expecting anyone to be different from who they are. Healing servants of Romans, eating with tax collectors, treating enemies with basic dignity. And that doesn't mean he didn't tell the truth. We have plenty of woe to those statements, naming the suffering his enemies were causing, but that's never all they were. Those around Jesus were, first and foremost, children of God. Such an approach interrupts the common scripts of who we think we are and who we think our enemies are. It interrupts them enough to create this room for doubt and creativity. It speaks to the basic needs for respect and empathy in each of us, disarming us with that question: is this really who I want to be? And in so doing, Jesus would, as Fred Rogers once put it, love them into loving. Now, does that mean it will always work? No. But it is a counterintuitive truth that if you want your enemy to change, shame, judgment, and hatred are more often barriers to that change. Hate does more damage to the one who hates than the one who is hated, and just locks the one who is hated into their role. To thin those barriers, one must first love their enemy exactly the way they are. And that brings us to an important question. How exactly are we supposed to do that? To just white knuckle it and love Jim Clark? To push away all those buzzing feelings of hatred and resentment? To force a smile? And this is something that kills me about Jesus. I feel like he's often really good at the what. Go love your enemies. Go take care of the least of these. Go give away your wealth. But when it comes to the how exactly we're supposed to become the kind of people capable of these things, he can be infuriatingly quiet. It often feels like he's telling me to go to the moon, leaving me to ask, okay, but can you tell me anything about how to build a rocket? And that's where other spiritual traditions have been so helpful for me. Often, Eastern traditions are an excellent complement to Jesus' commandments to justice, teaching us how to become the kind of people capable of that justice to begin with. And when it comes to this particular commandment, to love my enemy, it was a modern teacher named Ram Dass that gave me what I felt like was the key to make this possible. And his teaching is to love people like trees. When you go out into the woods, Ram Dass taught, and you look at trees, you see all these different trees. And some of them are bent, and some are straight, and some are evergreens, and some are whatever. And you look at the tree and you allow it. You see why it is the way it is. You sort of understand, oh, it didn't get enough light, and so it turned that way. And you don't get all emotional about it. You just appreciate the tree. But the moment you get near humans, you lose all of that. You're constantly saying, well, you're to this, or I'm to that. And that judgment mind comes in. And so he teaches, I practice turning people into trees, which means appreciating them just the way they are. Can you imagine what it would be like to love a person like a tree? To love Megan Phelps Roper like a tree. Or Jim Clark like a tree. Imagine seeing them, and rather than seeing all the things they're not, seeing them as they are. Getting curious about what happened to make them this way. When you look at Megan Phelps Roper, do you see the little girl made to be deeply scared of what God would do to her if she didn't behave a certain way or hate the right people? Told that pleasing her family was the only way she would be safe or included. And what are each of us but trees, growing the only way we ever could have grown? And what does that mean for how we treat one another or ourselves going forward? Thich Nhat Hanh, a famously successful transformer of people, once said, when you plant lettuce, if it doesn't grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons that it's not growing well. It may need fertilizer or more water or less sun. You never blame the lettuce. Yet if we have problems with friends or family, we blame them. If we know how to take care of them, however, they can grow well like lettuce. Blaming has no positive effect, nor does trying to persuade using reason or argument. That's my experience. But if you understand, and you can show that you understand, then you can love, and the situation can change. I don't think Jesus ever meant for us to just white knuckle anything. I think he meant for us to, as he taught, see as the divine sees. To understand as the divine understands. Sending rain on the just and unjust alike so that they can grow like lettuce. To see someone like this is to make hatred impossible. It's to make love not a goal, but just the natural consequence of understanding. We still speak the truth, still set boundaries, still resist and interrupt, but we do so in a way that's effective, that doesn't blame the lettuce, but creates conditions in which we can grow. But there's one more thing about loving our enemies that I think is important to touch on, because it's easy to get the wrong idea, I think. There's a lot of wisdom to this teaching when it comes to transforming ourselves and our enemies. But there's also this important distinction that we need to make. Because I think it's one thing to look at a story of someone loving Megan Phelps Roper into being, but for someone like Jim Clark, it feels like something else. There are times when loving the individual is a powerful form of persuasion, and the individual can change, but there are also times when there is little to no hope of an individual changing. And loving your enemies can't be about that. It has to be about something bigger. It's about changing the entire system in which your enemy is caught. I got to have coffee this week with Beth Matska downtown, and she mentioned the work of Jim Lawson to me. That was a name that I had somehow never heard. Right? And she gave me some of the history, but for those of you like me who have never encountered Jim Lawson's work, I think it's appropriate to spend a second with his work here, because he understood the power of loving your enemy on a scale that some of us don't think about. Jim Lawson, I learned, was a student at Vanderbilt Divinity in the late 50s and early 60s. Before he'd come to Vanderbilt, he'd already spent time in a federal prison for refusing military service in the Korean War. Spent 3 years in India studying Gandhi's strategies of nonviolent resistance, and met Martin Luther King in 1957, who encouraged him to come to the South to teach all of these strategies that he'd been learning. At Vanderbilt, Lawson began offering weekly workshops in nonviolent resistance. Reverend James Bevel, from the Jim Clark story earlier, he was one of Lawson's students. They would talk about a philosophy of nonviolence rooted in Jesus' teaching to love your enemy. They would engage in practical role-playing to learn self-control in the face of an attack, and create strategies for where and how resistance would be most effective in interrupting practices of oppression. And by the end, Lawson's group had staged numerous sit-ins, put leaders and unjust practices firmly in the spotlight, and applied enough economic pressure that desegregation became a possibility. Martin Luther King would later call the group's efforts the best organized and most disciplined in the Southland. Once in an interview, Lawson said, "Nonviolence is power. It is not, as I was originally told, just persuasion. Persuasion is a form of power, but power is bigger than just persuasion. Aristotle said that power is the capacity to achieve purpose. It is a God-given gift of creation to human beings." Loving your neighbor is not just powerful because it's a tool to persuade and transform individual enemies. It can be powerful because it is a tool to transform an entire system. And Jesus, facing the Roman Empire, knew that well. It can change the definition of an enemy from an individual to the system that produced that individual in the first place. It uses the same ethic of Ram Dass's teaching to see people like trees, but projected largely onto a nation or a society. It compassionately understands why an oppressive system is the way it is, refuses to perpetuate patterns of dehumanization and violence, and strategically seeks to interrupt those patterns, like Thich Nhat Hanh with his lettuce. And that can mean illegally sitting at a particular lunch counter to create pressure and shine a spotlight. It can mean strategically destroying property to interrupt a dehumanizing practice, like Father Dan Berrigan breaking in and burning draft cards. It can mean doing our own spiritual work to root out destructive patterns in our own minds. It can look like a lot of things, but at its core, loving our enemy on a systemic scale is about refusing to return hate for hate, instead transforming hate so that what we're fighting doesn't just show up again in the new society we're trying to create. Loving our enemy is not just about persuading individuals, but about owning our power for effective, transformative change. And there's more to be said, and there's always more to be said, especially with a text like this. But as always, I want to draw us to a close by asking the most important question, which is, where do I see myself in all of this? Where do I see myself in the story of folks like Megan Phelps Roper, transforming our neighbors and ourselves through love? Where do I see myself in this challenge to love people like trees, understanding them and tending to them like lettuce? Where do I see myself in the stories of those like James Lawson, transforming oppressive systems by strategically embodying better ones? The question is, where are you in all of this? And over the next few moments, as Jake plays, I want to invite you to spend some time asking that question. There are prompts in the liturgy guide, and if that's helpful, you can use the pencils in the pews to jot down what comes up for you. Or you can just close your eyes and see what arises. But we're going to spend some time doing that now. And with openness and curiosity, I invite you into that time of discernment.